Hi, my name is Joseph Nicolello, English Department at Fordham University. And today I'm going to be discussing Inferno 14 with Rafa. And we're going to be coming from two different perspectives that actually synthesize quite well. In my case, I use Dante a lot in my scholarship and my developing dissertation idea. And at the same time, Dante plays a major role in the structural development of a novel that I recently published. This is all very heavily influenced by classical studies and classical literature, and Rafa is going to be specifically covering the classical field in Inferno 14. So with that, I turn it over to Rafa.
Thanks, Joseph. Yeah, my name is Rafael Torre de Silva. I'm an undergraduate student at New York University, and I'm majoring in classics. I've always been amazed by Dante's rewriting of the classical tradition, how he's able to turn everything upside down in his head, and by changing the tone and redirecting the themes. And this is precisely why I've chosen to work with Joseph on Canto 14 of the Inferno, because it's just packed with classical references and rhetorical style. It is a canto that not only challenges the reader, but also tries to convey an idea about classical thought. Thus, we can distinguish actually two main ideas in this canto, which actually work in two different spheres, its structure and its content. First, regarding its structure, the fact that it is full of classical references helped Dante build a thesis which argues for the importance of classical thinking. He presents the synthesis of human truth and Christian faith, and the latter reconciles and elevates the former to the divine realm of revelation. But not only does Dante praise classical truths, but also corrects them. He presents the value of both worlds and then defends the predominance of Christian doctrine. Second, in terms of the content, the main thesis of the canto is that hell is oneself. Our sins, for which we are responsible, become our own punishment. Dante presents a world of responsibility and self-inflicted unhappiness. We can therefore see how these two ideas are particularly relevant for here and now. First, in terms of the classical thought, we find ourselves in a world of revisionism, where, driven by ignorance, some sectors of society are trying to ban the classics from education, but they don't realize that these works are not frozen objects to be contemplated in a museum. They are alive, and they contain lessons for today. From the perspective of history, evidently, we cannot forget where we come from. These classical texts are indeed the basis of our civilization. And from a moral perspective, these works contain clear and immutable truths about our human nature, which by their own definition, they're already useful for us. Second, in terms of hell being oneself, we also find ourselves in a world of external blame. We complain about the other people's faults, and we oftentimes neglect to examine ourselves. Thus, Dante is trying to convey these two lessons from both the content and the structure of Canto 14. Now, diving into the very narration of the canto, we find ourselves in the seventh circle, that of violence, on the third ring, violence against God, and of the first of the three categories of sinners, the ones that committed violence against God himself, that is, the blasphemers and the deniers of God. So these ones are lying supine on the ground, and if you think about it, this is the perfect position to represent the complete humiliation they deserve. Those who dare to stand up and raise their fists against the heavens are now lying on the dirt. And we already see a similar image to that of the Tower of Babel in the Bible, albeit unmentioned, where they try to reach the heavens through their proud and arrogant height, and they were brought down to the ground. And the same happens to the blasphemers. Then we also find a reference to Cato the Younger from Lucan's Pharsalia, Book 9. Dante makes the case that this is a similar sand to that which Cato walked upon on his way to the battle against Julius Caesar. And again, he could have used any other reference from the Bible to describe the desert, but no, he chose Cato. And this is very interesting because Cato, in fact, represents a virtuous pagan. He's the hero of the poem in Lucan. He's the only laudable man in the midst of flawed and unattractive characters and terrible actions of sacrilege and insanity of civil war. But he remains faithful to his ideals. He's virtuous. And then again, another classical reference is the flakes of fire from a letter that Alexander the Great supposedly wrote to his tutor Aristotle. And this fire that falls from heaven on top of the Sodomites and the blasphemers reminds obviously to the reader of Genesis 19, where God brought down fire onto the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. But no, here instead of mentioning the passage from the Bible, Dante chooses a classical reference, which is interesting because, again, through the structure of the canto, he's trying to reinforce his message about the importance of classical thought. Then we arrive at the topic of blasphemy, leaving behind the theme of the landscape, and we start focusing on the very sin of the canto. And once again, this is blasphemy against the Christian God, but Dante uses a classical reference. He chooses the Theban cycle, which basically becomes the lens through which he focuses on blasphemy, and he treats blasphemy against Zeus or Jove, a pagan god, as equivalent to the blasphemy against the Christian deity. He doesn't choose Christian politicians of his time, which would have obviously been incredibly easy for him, but no, he chooses mythology. And the question would be, why? Why is he choosing mythology? And again, if you also think about it, in my opinion, mythology becomes this universal set of rules, this kind of atemporal compilation of principles, just as the natural law. And he's making the case that blasphemy is a sin against natural law. Even in a world of pagans, it is a sin to compare yourself to a god, which in fact proves the point I was making earlier, that the pagan classics contain innate truths about humanity. Dante is starting to build thus a contrast between pagan sinners and pagan heroes. And we've already seen the hero, Cato, and I will see the sinner, a guy called Capaneus. But before that, in verse 43 to 45, there's a very interesting scene where Dante presents the limitations of Virgil. Dante, a Christian author, is presenting the limitations of a pagan poet. So we see how he praises virtuous pagans, but he still makes clear that pagans are not the same as saints. So he makes this distinction that yeah, you can be virtuous according to natural law, but still Christian faith is above classical thought. Now, Capaneus is this hero from Thebes that is first referenced in Aeschylus in 7 Against Thebes, but obviously Dante took it from Statius Thebaid because he could only read Latin. And not only is Capaneus a reference to the classics, but in his speech, he also displays a high-tone classical rhetoric with very complex syntax. And you would expect the sinner who repents or is sad for his own sin, but no, he boasts of his very own fault. He's proud even after death. There is no repentance and therefore no forgiveness. He's unchanged. And here we come to one of the most important verses of this canto, verse 51, where Capaneus says, "Qual io fui vivo, tal son morto." Just as I was living, so am I dead. Because indeed, hell is being eternally oneself. We are our own hell. This is no longer Sartre's famous dictum where he says, "L'enfer c'est les autres," hell is other people. No, Dante's principle is built on personal responsibility. Hell is the extension of our earthly realities. That's why there are some in limbo and others down below, because you are your own hell, not because of God's external decision. And in fact, Capaneus, not even after death, has tempered his defiance. He boasts that he's unchanged, as if that lack of change were something to be proud of. In reality, as Virgil points out, his arrogance is his own punishment. Sin is not happiness, because God's decrees agree with human nature. If God forbids something, it's because it actually makes you unhappy. And that is what Virgil actually says in verse 63 to 66, where he says, "O Capaneo, in ciò che non s'ammorza la tua superbia, sei tu più punito. Nullo martiro, fuor che la tua rabbia, sarebbe al tuo furor dolor compito." I mean, this is a beautiful passage where Virgil, a virtuous pagan, is correcting a sinful pagan. He's saying, no, you don't get it. It is actually your very own arrogance that is making you unhappy still down here. Leaving behind Capaneus, we reach the second part of the canto, which actually restates the moral lesson of the first half. Capaneus says, "We are our own hell," is restated in a slightly different way with this new image, that of the Veglio di Creta, the Old Man of Crete. The image of the statue is taken from the book of Daniel in the Bible. And the idea of the decadence of humankind through the ages, from Golden Age to Silver Age to Bronze Age, then Iron, and then the Clay Age, is taken from Hesiod. But for Dante, it's taken from Ovid's Metamorphoses. So again, we see this reconciliation between the Bible and the classical tradition, between human truths and Christian faith, that they are hand to hand, touching on the same moral truths. And then we arrive at the main idea of this image, which is that the tears that come out of this statue form the rivers of hell. The rivers of hell are made of tears. And this reminds us of a verse in Book 1 of the Aeneid, where the hero says, sunt lacrimae rerum, et mentem mortalia tangunt, which is literally translated, there are tears for things and mortal events touch the mind. This happens when Aeneas is gazing at the wall of the Carthaginian temple that depicts battles of the Trojan War, and he's looking at the deaths of his friends and companions. And this whole sentence, that there are tears for things and mortal things touch the mind, encapsulates the futility and the waste of human life. But the image of the tears in Dante has a very different tone from Virgil's. Virgil simply states it without any ethical context, while Dante chooses not to represent the melancholy. That is, the almost lack of sense and direction in human life. That of the futility, there are tears for things and nothing makes much sense. Rather, Dante decides to capture the justice, the culpability, and the responsibility in the moral failure of humans. So on the one hand, he's inserting an ethical reading on the classics, which is actually how he Christianizes the classical thinking, by providing a truth that is objective. And yes, the truths in the classical world are restated, purified, and confirmed by the Catholic faith, by the Christian faith. And on the other hand, he's presenting a concept of responsibility, the fact that our own tears, the tears of human history, make the rivers of hell, the rivers of our own suffering. So our suffering causes our own suffering. It is our sins that become our punishment. So hell is not imposed upon us from the outside, but it is our own creation. We are our own hell. And with all these having been said, and much more that I don't have the time to cover right now, I turn it over to you, Joseph.
All right, great. Thank you, Rafa. A lot of what you said in terms of some of the themes and ideas and symbols and descriptions are quite evident in the chapter of my book that is 100 chapters altogether that correlates precisely with Inferno 14 here. And down at the bottom of this fictional town of Jerusalem, Pennsylvania, which the first part takes place in, we might say that that river, in its own way, is made of human tears. And I'll explain a little bit here. So the protagonist of the book is William Fellows, who later goes by the Pilgrim. And, as you'd mentioned Sartre there, William as well is cognizant that while Sartre's idea of hell being other people is, amusing perhaps on the surface level or in the midst of one's philosophical education, as a statement, it is insufficient. But he is not quite at the self-awareness of Dante yet. And so he has to find out through a disastrous encounter with the love of his life, Helena Caravan. And that is what this encounter in essence is. And so as Dante works with various authors and various figures work throughout his text, I do as well. And not only are there classical figures and medieval figures, but I thought that one from the 20th century in English literature, from a guy, Malcolm Lowry, who wrote Under the Volcano, will set the tone nicely. In there we read, and this is in William's mind as he approaches this house, and this is how I sometimes think of myself, as a great explorer who has discovered some extraordinary land from which he can never return to give his knowledge to the world. But the name of this land is hell. So with that being said, we get to see how the canto interlaps a bit with my chapter in terms of the setting of Jerusalem, Pennsylvania. The rings, for instance, that Dante writes of, these are almost like emotional and dialogical and also interior rings and sort of force fields in a sense that separate parts of the town from one another and ideas and people from connecting properly. And so we see this right away in the character of Miss Caravan or Luigi, who are these sort of idolaters and blasphemers. But the catch is that William himself seems to have, comprehended all there is to know about religion. And in a sense, he is beyond it. But it really takes the flakes of fire that he approaches and blasphemous dialogue and the eventual disgraceful outcome of the afternoon that really is the lesson for him. Like he kind of moves from exclusively his knowledge and understanding of things through books to now beginning to understand, let's say, perhaps how the world actually works. And so in his case, there's also something that might be relevant for our times, and I think certainly relevant in the situation some of these characters of Dante's find themselves in, Rafa, as you had mentioned, and correlative in a sense. This idea of, a person can be guilty of a crime for having been suggested that they're guilty of it. Like that's kind of the beginning and end of the idea of the judgment, rather than getting a fair trial and seeing if a person is guilty or not. They may well be innocent, but we see that this goes both ways, and that perhaps in Dante's case, as in mine, some characters that we might think logically are condemned in a certain way, and others are going to get off scot-free. That's not so much the case, and it's a mix of empirical experience with William's own understandings of Homer, Horace, Macrobius, and even Ficino's Platonic theology, some of the implications therein. So coming face to face with what was supposed to be a glorious afternoon for this character, with these sort of illusions giving way one by one, almost like links of a chain getting cut off one by one. We might call to mind Inferno 14, 16 through 24, which I'll read briefly in the equivalent of an English translation. O vengeance of the Lord, how you should be dreaded by everyone who now can read whatever was made manifest to me. I saw so many flocks of naked souls, all weeping miserably, and it seemed that they were ruled by different decrees. Some lay upon the ground, flat on their backs. Some huddled in a crouch, and there they sat, and others moved about incessantly. So this is precisely where arrogance and idolatry in this fictional small town of Jerusalem, Pennsylvania, lead to, in another sense of the chapter and the various things unfolding. What might translate into English in lines 63 through 64 of Inferno 14, this idea of unquenched arrogance. Again, this being a logical conclusion of it, but one that, let's say, adolescent maybe, or inexperienced idea of love, and this idea of coming face to face more so with the fact that hell is in fact one's own doing, and the implications that can have for others. Moving ahead a little bit, we see correlations in the chapters in several places, and things even like family chronology of the caravan family can be read alongside the canto. Things that are a little more obvious and simpler are also tied in, things that don't need to be, subtly unpacked by Dante scholars, but maybe even someone loosely familiar with Dante, with the old man with a head of fine gold in Inferno 103 through 106. In Jerusalem, Pennsylvania, that turns into a head that visually, if not literally, is made invisible by first a bag of charcoal and then by raging flames of a fire doused with lighter's fluid. This also gives way to flakes of fire, which in Jerusalem, Pennsylvania, are not so much those of Dante's or the Hebraic Sodom and Gomorrah, but more so cigarette ash. So there's, the macro and the micro at work. So in the conclusion of the canto, we read something like in the Mandelbaum translation, then he declared, the time has come to quit this wood. See that you would follow close behind me. These margins form a path that does not scorch, and over them all flaming vapor is quenched. This is, I think, sets a tone to kind of, perhaps I'll even cut myself off from my own commentary on the book there for any interested readers that might want to see exactly how that correlates or see some other medias available. I think that the main thing now is to, just really sort of cherish the synthesis of classical thought, how it's working in this character. We're aware that he has read these characters and he is leading a Dantean existence unbeknownst to him. And it is a synthesis that I think, has a lot to say about our time, our readings of Dante. I hope that, I hope that a lot of this has come across clearly. And as you mentioned, Rafa, it was, the most that we could do with the time. So with that, I will maybe hand it over to you some parting thoughts. And thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Joseph. I just wanted to add that by listening to what you were saying, that the respect for the classics that Canto 14 transmits, should not only encourage us to read them, but also to write new ones. And just as you've shown, basically, if you want to preserve the classics, it is not enough to simply read them and kind of resurrect them, but also to continue the conversation. Because I guess we also need to wrestle with the same existential questions. And moved by the prudent and proper intellectual self-esteem to try to create new classics. And we need to keep the literary tradition alive. We need to learn from the past vestiges and blaze a new trail in the journey ahead of us, in the journey of humanity towards beauty, truth, and goodness, basically. And that's all we got.